The lawyer's hands were shaking when he slid the envelope across his mahogany desk. "Liam," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you need to sit down for this." I was already sitting, but something in his tone made my stomach drop. This wasn't just another meeting about my parents' estate distribution. This was something else entirely. Something that would either destroy me or change everything I thought I knew about family, fairness, and the brutal mathematics of favoritism that had defined every single day of my 27 years on this earth. My name is Liam, and I'm 27 years old. The day that changed my life didn't start with champagne and celebration. It didn't start with congratulations or well wishes or any of the things you might imagine when someone's life takes a dramatic turn for the better. It started with my parents calling me into their pristine living room, the one with the white carpets my mother obsessed over, the one where I'd learned as a child that some people were born to leave marks and others were born to clean them up. I already knew something was wrong the moment I heard my father's voice on the phone that morning, that careful tone in his voice, the one he reserved for delivering news he'd already decided I had no say in. That tone hung in the air like smoke before a fire, a warning that something was about to burn. My brother Marcus sat on the leather couch, scrolling through his phone with the casual indifference of someone who'd never questioned his place in the world, never wondered if he was loved less or valued differently. He was 29, 2 years older than me, and in those 2 years, he'd somehow accumulated a lifetime of preferential treatment. The golden child, the chosen one, the son whose soccer games Dad never missed while mine were always scheduled during important work meetings. The son whose college tuition came without lectures about responsibility and the value of hard work, while I worked 2 part-time jobs to supplement my scholarship because it builds character. The son whose failures were always reframed as learning experiences, growth opportunities, chances to discover what he was really passionate about, while mine were held up as evidence of fundamental character flaws that needed to be corrected. I stood there in the doorway, arms crossed defensively across my chest, bracing myself for whatever comparison was coming next. I'd had 27 years of practice at this, 27 years of hearing about how Marcus was doing so well at his marketing job, how Marcus had gotten another promotion, how Marcus was dating someone wonderful, how Marcus was everything they'd hoped for in a son. And there I was, the project coordinator at a construction firm, steady and reliable, but never quite impressive enough. Never quite the success story they could brag about at dinner parties. They didn't make me wait long. My parents weren't cruel in an obvious way. They didn't beat me or scream at me or tell me directly that they loved Marcus more. Their cruelty was subtler, more insidious. It was in the comparisons, the different standards, the way they'd smile when talking about Marcus's accomplishments and nod politely when I mentioned mine. It was in the birthday presents that cost 3 times as much for him, the Christmas gifts that reflected actual thought about his interests versus generic items for me. It was in 1,000 small moments that accumulated over a lifetime into an undeniable pattern. My father cleared his throat, that authoritative sound that meant the decision was final before the conversation even began. He was a tall man, still imposing at 62, with silver hair and the kind of commanding presence that had served him well in his career as a corporate executive. He'd built a successful life through decisiveness and control, and he approached parenting the same way he approached business meetings, with predetermined outcomes and a script to follow. "We've decided it's time to help both our sons get a proper start in life," he announced, like he was unveiling a corporate merger instead of discussing his children's futures. His voice had that practiced tone, the one he used when he wanted to sound magnanimous while actually being completely self-serving. My mother smiled that tight, rehearsed smile she used when she wanted to appear generous while actually being calculating. She was petite, perfectly put together as always, not a hair out of place even at 59. She'd spent her life managing appearances, managing her husband's image, managing her sons like projects to be optimized. "We want to be fair," she added, and those 4 words sent ice through my veins because in our family, fair had always meant equal in appearance, but vastly different in value. Fair meant giving Marcus a car for his 16th birthday and giving me bus money and telling me it was the same because we both had transportation. Fair meant paying for Marcus's apartment during college while I lived in a cramped dorm with 3 roommates. Fair meant a lifetime of unequal treatment dressed up in the language of equity. Then she dropped it. Marcus was getting a brand new apartment in the city, downtown. A modern high-rise with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the river, a doorman who'd screen his visitors and accept his packages, a rooftop pool where he could entertain his friends and impress his girlfriend, a fitness center with equipment that cost more than most people's cars, and a view that probably cost more per month in HOA fees than most people paid in rent. She had the listing pulled up on her tablet, and she showed it to me like I was supposed to be excited for him, like I was supposed to smile and nod and congratulate my brother on yet another advantage handed to him on a silver platter. My brother finally looked up from his phone and smiled, not surprised, just satisfied, like he'd been expecting this all along, like he'd already known this was coming and had just been waiting for the formal announcement. That smile told me everything I needed to know. They'd discussed this with him beforehand, probably weeks ago. They'd consulted him on what he wanted, what would suit his needs, what would make him happy. I was the only one being informed rather than consulted. I was the only one whose preferences didn't matter. Then my mother turned to me, and I watched her expression shift into something that was supposed to look like excitement, but came across as pity wrapped in encouragement. Her eyes softened in that way that meant she was about to deliver news she expected me to have feelings about, news she'd need to manage and spin and reframe. "And Liam," she said, her voice rising with false enthusiasm that made my skin crawl, "we're giving you a house." For exactly half a second, hope flickered in my chest like a candle in the wind. A house. That sounded substantial, permanent, significant. That sounded like maybe this time the scales were actually balanced, like maybe this time I wasn't getting the scraps. A house was bigger than an apartment, right? A house meant land, meant ownership, meant something real and lasting. Maybe this time they actually saw me as equal to Marcus. Maybe this time they were actually being fair and more than just name. Then my father pulled out his tablet and showed me the address and the photos, and that fragile hope shattered like glass hitting concrete, the sound of it breaking echoing through my mind, even though no actual sound was made. The house looked like something from a horror movie, but not the kind that scares you with supernatural entities and jump scares. This was the kind that scares you with reality, with the crushing weight of neglect and decay, with the evidence of how far something can fall when no one cares enough to catch it. The photos showed a structure that had given up on being a home years ago, maybe decades ago. Cracked walls with paint peeling in long strips like dead skin sloughing off a corpse. Windows either broken completely, just jagged edges of glass still clinging to rotted frames, or boarded up with plywood that had itself started to rot and warp. A roof that sagged in the middle like the spine of something dying, shingles missing in patches that probably leaked like sieves every time it rained. The front yard was a jungle of weeds taller than me, brown and dead and tangled, choking out any sign that life had once been cared for there. An old chain-link fence listed to one side, held up more by the weeds growing through it than by its own structural integrity. The concrete walkway to the front door was cracked and buckled, chunks missing entirely, weeds growing through every gap. The porch sagged dangerously, the wood blackened with rot, railings missing entirely in some sections. It looked abandoned. Worse, it looked like even the city had written it off, like code enforcement had driven by, taken one look, and decided it wasn't worth the paperwork to condemn it officially. Like the neighbors had stopped complaining years ago because everyone had just accepted that this was a lost cause, a blight on the neighborhood that would eventually collapse under its own weight. My mother rushed to fill the silence, her words tumbling out in a rehearsed explanation that she'd clearly practiced, probably in front of the mirror while getting ready that morning. "It's full of potential, Liam. And you're the practical one. You've always been good with your hands. You've always been resourceful and creative. This suits you better. Marcus, well, he needs something safe and ready. His career is so demanding. He works such long hours. He doesn't have time for projects or renovations. But you've always enjoyed that sort of thing, haven't you? Remember when you fixed that bookshelf in your room? And you helped your friend repair his car that one time?" That phrase, the practical one, I'd been hearing it my entire life, and somewhere along the way, probably around age 23 or 24, I'd finally cracked the code. It didn't mean capable or skilled or talented. It meant convenient. It meant the one we can give less to because he'll figure it out. It meant the one who won't complain, who'll smile and nod and carry the weight because that's what he's always done. It meant the son who doesn't require the same investment, the same care, the same consideration. It meant expendable. My father added his piece, his tone suggesting this was all perfectly logical, perfectly reasonable, as if he were explaining a sound business decision rather than revealing a massive disparity in how he valued his children. The property's been in a trust from your grandmother's estate. Been sitting there for years, just rotting away, costing us money in taxes and maintenance. We were going to sell it, just dump it on the market and be done with it. But we thought, why not give you boys each something? It's about equity, son. You're both getting real estate. That's fair, right? Marcus gets an apartment, you get a house. Both property, both valuable, both a solid foundation for your futures. Equity. That word burned in my chest like acid. Because equity isn't about giving everyone the same thing. True equity is about giving everyone what they need to succeed, accounting for different circumstances and challenges and starting points. But in our family, it had become a magic word they used to justify inequality, a shield against accusations of favoritism. Marcus gets a $400,000 move-in-ready apartment in the city's most desirable neighborhood. Liam gets a condemned building that should probably be demolished. Call it equity, call it fair, call it whatever makes you sleep at night. Problem solved. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand why my brother's comfort mattered more than mine, why his time was valuable and mine was expendable, why I was always the one expected to turn garbage into gold while he was handed treasure wrapped in a bow. I wanted to ask when they decided I was worth less, what age I'd been when they'd looked at their two sons and decided one deserved everything and the other deserved what was left over. I wanted to know if they'd ever loved me the same way they loved Marcus, or if I'd always been the backup plan, the spare, the one who existed to make their golden child look even better by comparison. But 27 years of being the reasonable son, the one who didn't rock the boat, the one who swallowed disappointment and called it gratitude, that training kicked in like muscle memory, like a reflex I couldn't control even when I wanted to. I nodded. I thanked them. I swallowed every word I actually wanted to say and replaced it with the words they wanted to hear, the words that would make this easier for them, the words that would let them continue believing they were good parents who treated their children fairly. Thank you, I heard myself say, my voice sounding distant and hollow even to my own ears. This is very generous. I appreciate you thinking of me. The lies tasted like ashes in my mouth, but I said them anyway because that's what I'd been trained to do. They signed the papers quickly, efficiently, like businessmen closing a deal they were eager to move past, probably eager to get to the celebratory dinner they'd planned with Marcus to toast his new apartment. The deed transfer happened right there in their living room, witnessed by their lawyer, a man named Henderson who'd known our family for years and didn't quite meet my eyes as he notarized my signature. Maybe he saw the inequality. Maybe he just didn't care. Either way, he said nothing. The house is yours, Liam. No mortgage, no rent, just yours. Free and clear. My mother beamed like she'd just solved all my problems, like she'd just handed me the keys to the kingdom instead of the keys to a building that was probably a health hazard. Isn't that wonderful? Complete ownership. You're a homeowner now. Meanwhile, as she continued talking, I learned that Marcus's apartment was being fully paid for by them. Not just the purchase, but everything. Furnished professionally with modern pieces from that expensive store downtown, where single chairs cost what I made in a week. Decorated with art chosen by a consultant my mother had hired specifically for this purpose. My mother had already hired an interior designer, a woman named Svetlana who apparently specialized in urban contemporary living spaces and charged $200 an hour for her services. She showed me pictures on her tablet of throw pillows that cost $80 each, of a coffee table that was listed at $1,200, of curtains that cost more than my monthly car payment. I moved into the house 1 week later. I had 3 boxes of belongings, a sleeping bag I'd used for camping trips in college, and a rapidly dying sense of optimism that was being kept alive only by sheer stubbornness and the fact that I literally had nowhere else to go. My apartment lease was up, and I couldn't afford to renew it and pay for storage and save for a new place. This house, as terrible as it was, represented a roof over my head and no monthly rent payment. In the harsh mathematics of my budget, that mattered more than pride. The first night, it rained, and I discovered that roof was an optimistic term for the collection of shingles and gaping holes above my head. Water didn't just drip, it streamed, it poured, it cascaded through multiple points in the ceiling. I'd placed buckets strategically based on the water stains I could see on the ceiling, but I hadn't counted on new leaks opening up, on the rain-finding paths I hadn't anticipated. I spent half the night moving buckets, emptying buckets, placing towels, moving towels, listening to the symphony of drips and splashes that mocked my decision to accept this place. The heater didn't work, hadn't worked in probably a decade based on the rust and corrosion I found when I opened the access panel. The pilot light was out, and when I tried to relight it following instructions I found online, nothing happened. The gas line might be disconnected. The whole unit might be shot. I didn't know enough to diagnose it, and I certainly couldn't afford to hire someone to look at it. This was October, and winter was coming, and I was facing the very real possibility of freezing in my own house. The floors creaked with every step, not the charming creak of an old home full of character, but the ominous creak of wood that might give out at any moment. Wood that had spent years absorbing moisture and slowly rotting from the inside out. I learned quickly which paths through the house were relatively safe and which sections of floor felt spongy and unstable under my weight. There was a spot near the bathroom where I was genuinely afraid I might fall through into the crawl space below. I stood there in the dark that first night, surrounded by the smell of mildew and rot and decades of neglect, listening to the rain leak through my inheritance, and I made a decision. This was still something. It might be scraps, it might be the worst thing my parents had ever given me, but it was mine. Legally, officially mine. And I would turn it into more than they ever imagined possible, not because I wanted to prove something to them, though that was definitely part of it, but because I needed to prove something to myself. I needed to know if I was actually the practical, resourceful person they claimed I was, or if that was just another label they'd stuck on me to justify giving me less. I worked 2 jobs. During the day, I was a project coordinator at a mid-sized construction firm called Bartlett & Sons, which turned out to be the most valuable gift my parents never intended to give me. Every single day, I was surrounded by people who knew how to build, how to repair, how to transform damaged structures into functional spaces. I worked with carpenters and electricians and plumbers and roofers. I sat in on meetings with architects and engineers. I reviewed building plans and permit applications and code compliance documents. And I asked questions. Constantly. Endlessly. I became that guy in the office, the one who wanted to understand not just what we were doing but why, what the alternatives were, what the best practices were, what the common mistakes were. My boss, a gruff 60-year-old named Tom Bartlett who'd been in construction for 40 years, took an interest in my curiosity. Most coordinators just want to manage the schedule and the budget, he told me. You actually want to understand the work. That's rare. I volunteered for site visits just to see how professionals approach problems. When we had a project involving structural repairs, I asked if I could tag along when the engineer did his assessment. When we were replacing a roof on a commercial building, I spent my lunch breaks watching the crew, asking them questions about technique and materials and what separated a roof that would last 5 years from one that would last 20. At night and on weekends, I became a student of renovation in every spare moment I had. YouTube became my university, my textbooks, my professors. I watched videos at 1.5 speed, taking notes on a yellow legal pad, pausing to understand the techniques, rewinding when I missed something important. I learned how to patch drywall, not just slap some compound in a hole, but actually repair it properly, so you couldn't tell it had ever been damaged. I learned how to replace broken windows, how to remove the old glazing compound, and carefully install new glass and create a proper seal. I learned how to identify load-bearing walls versus the ones I could modify or remove entirely if I wanted to change the layout. I borrowed tools from coworkers, guys like Dave who had a garage full of equipment and was happy to lend it out if it meant I'd learned something. I bought used equipment at estate sales and pawn shops, learning to spot the difference between a saw that was worn out and one that just needed a new blade and some maintenance. I scraped my knuckles raw learning through failure and repetition, through trying something, messing it up, researching what I did wrong, and trying again. I started with the roof because everything else was pointless if the water kept getting in, if the rain kept destroying whatever repairs I made to the interior. The roof was the foundation of everything else, the first line of defense against the elements. I spent 3 full weekends stripping old shingles, a backbreaking process that involved using a special shovel-like tool to pry up each shingle and the nails holding it down. My shoulders ached for days afterward. My hands were covered in blisters that burst and bled and made it painful to hold a fork at dinner. I discovered rotted plywood underneath, entire sections that had turned soft and spongy from years of water intrusion. I had to replace 12 full sheets of plywood, cutting them to size on sawhorses in the backyard, hauling them up a ladder that felt increasingly unstable with each trip. I installed new weatherproofing, rolling out tar paper and carefully overlapping the sections, sealing every seam, creating multiple layers of protection against water. Then came the shingles themselves. I watched probably 15 different videos on proper shingling technique before I felt confident enough to start. I learned about the importance of the starter course, about how to properly overlap each row, about how to nail them down securely without overdriving the nails, about how to create proper valleys where two roof planes met. I spent 5 weekends on that roof, working from dawn until dusk, my hands raw and bleeding, my body exhausted, but slowly, methodically, I created a roof that would actually keep the water out. I fell off the ladder twice during this process. The first time, I was reaching too far to the left instead of moving the ladder like I should have, and I lost my balance. I fell about 8 feet into the overgrown bushes below, landing on my shoulder hard enough to knock the wind out of me and leave a bruise that lasted 3 weeks. The second time, the ladder itself shifted on the uneven ground, and I barely managed to grab the gutter on my way down, hanging there for a terrifying moment before dropping the last 6 feet into the yard. Those bushes probably saved me from broken bones both times. Then the walls. I started in the living room, the main space I'd be occupying, the space that guests would see if I ever had any. I patched cracks with joint compound, learned the tedious process of applying it in layers, letting each layer dry completely, sanding it smooth, applying the next layer. I replaced sections of drywall that had crumbled completely, cutting out the damaged areas in neat squares, installing new drywall cut to fit perfectly, taping the seams with special mesh tape, mudding over them until you couldn't tell where the repair ended and the original wall began. That I learned how to tape and mud drywall seams until they disappeared completely, became invisible, looked like one continuous surface instead of multiple pieces joined together. This skill alone took me a month to develop, practicing on a section of wall in the garage where mistakes didn't matter, where I could try and fail and try again until I understood the exact consistency the joint compound needed to be, the exact angle to hold the knife, the exact pressure to apply. I painted everything a neutral warm gray because paint was cheap relative to other materials, and the transformation it provided was priceless. I learned about primer and how it seals porous surfaces and creates a uniform base for the final coat. I learned about cutting in along edges with a brush before using a roller on the main surfaces. I learned how to avoid roller marks and brush strokes, how to maintain a wet edge, how to create a smooth, professional-looking finish. The first room took me an entire weekend. By the 5th room, I could finish one in a day. The floors were a nightmare that haunted my dreams for weeks. Refinishing them myself seemed insane until I priced out hiring a professional and realized it would cost more than I'd make in 3 months at both my jobs combined. So I rented a floor sander, a massive heavy machine that vibrated so hard it made my teeth chatter, watched 7 different tutorial videos from professional floor refinishers, and spent 4 days on my hands and knees, breathing sawdust through a mask that didn't quite seal properly, breathing polyurethane fumes that gave me headaches and made me dizzy, bringing 100-year-old oak back to life. The process was methodical and unforgiving. Sand with coarse grit to remove the old finish and level the surface. Sand with medium grit to smooth out the scratches from the coarse grit. Sand with fine grit to create a surface smooth enough for finish. Vacuum meticulously between each stage because even one piece of grit can ruin the next stage. Apply the stain, working in sections, wiping off the excess, trying to maintain consistent color across the entire floor. Apply the polyurethane in thin coats, letting each coat dry completely, lightly sanding between coats with ultra-fine sandpaper. I did 3 coats of polyurethane. My back was screaming by the end of it. I'd spent so many hours bent over or on my knees that I could barely stand up straight. But when I finished, when I removed the last of the painter's tape and stood in that room looking at floors that gleamed like honey in the sunlight, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Pure, uncomplicated pride in something I'd created with my own hands. I cleaned out years of trash from the backyard, a task that took 3 full weekends and multiple trips to the dump. I pulled weeds that had root systems like ancient trees, some roots going down 2 feet or more, requiring a pickaxe to extract. I hauled out rusted appliances, an old washing machine that weighed probably 300 pounds and had to be dragged across the yard on a furniture dolly. I removed broken furniture that previous owners had abandoned, a couch so rotted and mildewed that it fell apart when I tried to move it, a dining table that was actually 3 different tables stacked on top of each other, all in various states of decay. I found things back there, artifacts of lives that had been lived in this house before it became abandoned. Old glass bottles, medicine bottles, and beer bottles and milk bottles with embossed lettering showing they were from the 1940s and 50s. A child's toy truck from that same era, metal and rusted but still recognizable, still holding the shape of something a kid had probably loved once. Pieces of china plates, broken but beautiful with delicate floral patterns. An old leather shoe, just one, that had somehow survived decades outside. Each item felt like a small window into the past, into the families who'd called this place home before time and neglect had transformed it into what my parents gave me. Months crawled by with agonizing slowness. Then 6 months. Then a year. The seasons changed, and I changed with them. Summer was brutal, working on the roof in 95-degree heat, sweat dripping off me constantly, going through gallons of water to stay hydrated. Fall was beautiful, comfortable working weather, the satisfaction of seeing real progress as I finished the exterior work before winter. Winter was harsh, working in the cold without proper heat, wearing layers of clothes inside the house, seeing my breath as I sanded and painted and repaired. Spring brought new challenges as the rains revealed leaks I hadn't found, forcing me to revisit the roof and seal areas I'd missed. The house began to change, not overnight, not dramatically like those TV renovation shows where everything transforms in 42 minutes minus commercials, but steadily, incrementally, like a patient recovering from a long illness. One room became livable, then another, then another. One system started working, then another. The transformation was so gradual that I sometimes couldn't see it until I looked at the before photos on my phone and realized how far I'd come. It wasn't flashy. It would never be Marcus's sleek downtown apartment with its sterile modern aesthetic and its designer furniture and its view of the city lights. But it became solid, warm, safe, real. It felt earned in a way nothing else in my life ever had. Every wall I'd patched, every floor I'd refinished, every window I'd replaced carried the weight of my labor, my time, my learning, my transformation from someone who didn't know the difference between drywall and plaster to someone who could renovate an entire house. I planted a small garden in the backyard, vegetables mostly because I was still pinching every penny, still working 2 jobs, still putting every spare dollar into the house. Tomatoes, peppers, zucchini, green beans, herbs. I built raised beds from reclaimed wood I found at a demolition site. Lumber that was being thrown away but was still perfectly good, just needed to be cut to size and screwed together. I installed a drip irrigation system from a kit I got on sale at the hardware store, running lines to each bed, setting it on a timer so the watering would happen automatically. Watching those first tomatoes ripen felt like a metaphor I was too tired to fully process. I'd taken seeds, tiny things that cost almost nothing, put them in dirt, given them water and sunlight, and they'd grown into plants that produced food. I'd taken a wrecked house, something my parents had considered worthless, given it time and effort and care, and it had transformed into something valuable. The parallel wasn't lost on me, even if I was too exhausted most days to think about it deeply. I refinished the original hardwood floors myself, a process I've already described, but which deserves mention again because of what I found underneath. When I pulled up the disgusting carpet in the bedrooms, carpet that had been there since probably the 1970s based on the pattern, I found pristine oak flooring underneath. Oak that had been protected from damage by that ugly carpet. Oak that responded to sanding and staining like it had been waiting decades for someone to care enough to bring it back to life. The golden honey color that emerged was absolutely beautiful, and it became the centerpiece of those rooms. I even added a small sunroom where the broken back porch used to be, using salvaged windows from a renovation project at work. The building we were working on was replacing all its windows with modern energy-efficient ones, and the old windows, perfectly good single-pane wood-framed windows from the 1960s, were going to be thrown in a dumpster. I asked if I could have them, loaded 8 of them into my truck, and designed a small addition using those windows as the walls. It wasn't to code for a living space, but as a sunroom, as a 3-season porch, it was perfect. I built the frame myself over the course of a month, working evenings after my day job, carefully measuring and cutting studs, making sure everything was level and square and properly supported. I installed the windows, caulking every gap, making sure they were weathertight. I put in a simple concrete floor, mixing the concrete in a wheelbarrow because a full mixer rental was too expensive. I added a couple of rocking chairs I found at a yard sale and refinished. It became my favorite space in the entire house, where morning light poured in from 3 sides and I could drink coffee and feel something close to peace, where I could sit and watch my garden grow and feel like maybe, just maybe, I was building something real. That's when my parents asked to visit. I should have known better. I should have heard the warning in my mother's overly casual tone when she called on a Tuesday evening. "We'd love to see what you've done with the place, honey. I'm sure you've worked so hard. Your father and I were just talking about how we never got to see the house after you moved in, and we'd really like to come by this weekend if you're available. Would Saturday work?" But I was proud. Stupidly, naively proud. I wanted them to see. I wanted them to witness what I'd accomplished. I wanted them to acknowledge that I'd taken their scraps and built something real, something valuable. I wanted, on some deep level I barely acknowledged to myself, for them to finally see me as capable, as worthy, as equal to Marcus. I wanted their approval like I was still a child bringing home a good report card, hoping this would be the time they'd smile at me the way they smiled at my brother. "Saturday works," I told her. "Come around noon." They arrived precisely at noon. My parents were nothing if not punctual. My mother wore heels, completely impractical for a house tour, but perfect for the show she was performing, the performance of a well-dressed woman visiting her son's home. My father was in business casual, khakis and a polo shirt, checking his phone every 30 seconds like he had somewhere more important to be, like this was just another appointment on his calendar between the golf course and dinner with friends. My mother walked through the front door and froze. Completely stopped moving, her body going rigid, her eyes scanning the space like a machine processing data it wasn't programmed to handle. She took in the clean walls, the walls I'd patched and painted with my own hands. She saw the refinished floors gleaming in the sunlight pouring through new windows I'd installed myself after watching tutorials and borrowing tools. She noticed the built-in shelving I'd installed in the living room, using plans I'd found online and modified to fit the specific dimensions of the space. Her lips parted, and I waited for pride, for acknowledgement, for warmth, for something maternal. What I got was calculation. I watched it happen in real time, the shift in her expression from surprise to assessment, like she was an appraiser determining value rather than a mother seeing her son's achievement. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she began walking through the space more deliberately, opening closets, running her hand along the counter in the kitchen where I'd replaced every cabinet door and updated the fixtures to brushed nickel. My father stayed quiet, his jaw tight, his eyes moving from room to room with an intensity that made my skin prickle with warning. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't complimenting the work. He was thinking, calculating, and something in his expression made my stomach sink even before I understood why. Marcus wasn't there, which should have been my first clue that something was orchestrated about this visit, that this wasn't just a casual drop-by to see how I was doing. Marcus was always there for the good news, for the celebrations, for the moments where he could bask in reflected glory or compare his successes to mine. His absence was strategic, deliberate. They hadn't wanted him here for this conversation. They'd wanted to deliver whatever message they'd come to deliver without witnesses, without someone who might question the fairness of what they were about to do. My mother walked through every room. The living room with its refinished floors and fresh paint. The kitchen where I'd torn out old linoleum and found original tile underneath, tile I'd cleaned and routed until it looked almost new. The bathroom where I'd replaced the toilet, the sink, the shower fixtures, everything that had been broken or rusted or simply too disgusting to keep. The 2 bedrooms where I'd repaired walls and refinished floors and installed new closet systems using materials from the hardware store. She saw the sunroom I'd built, walked into it slowly, ran her hand along the window frames, looked out at the small garden I'd planted. She turned back to look at me, and her expression was unreadable. My father joined her in the sunroom, and they had a whispered conversation I couldn't quite hear, their heads close together, his hand on her elbow. When they turned back to face me, I knew. I don't know how I knew, but I knew that whatever came next was going to be bad. My mother finally spoke, and her words didn't land like a slap. They landed like a demolition ball, immediate and total destruction, the kind of impact that doesn't just damage but completely obliterates. Liam, we need to talk about something important. Your father and I have been discussing this as a family, and we've decided this arrangement isn't working out the way we anticipated. We're going to need this house back. It's going to belong to Marcus now. You have 48 hours to move out. I stared at her, my brain struggling to process the words because surely I'd misheard. Surely my own mother wasn't standing in the house I'd rebuilt from ruins. The house I'd spent every spare dollar and every spare moment transforming from a condemned wreck into a livable home, and telling me she was taking it away. Surely this was a joke, a test, something other than what it appeared to be. But she continued, her voice steady, explanatory, reasonable, like she was solving a logistics problem rather than destroying her son's life. Like this was a business decision that unfortunately had to be made. It's become clear that the distribution wasn't fair, Liam. We thought we were being equitable, but we didn't fully consider all the factors. Marcus's apartment is too small, just 850 square feet, and this house, well, you've done such an amazing job with it. It's much larger, probably 1,800 square feet now that you've opened up some of the rooms. It's much more valuable than we anticipated. We need to rebalance the family assets. Surely you understand that's only fair. I found my voice, though it came out strangled, rough, like I was speaking through a throat full of broken glass. The house is legally mine. You signed the deed over. It's in my name, recorded with the county, completely transferred. My mother waved her hand dismissively, like legal ownership was a minor inconvenience rather than the entire foundation of property rights, like centuries of property law could be set aside with a casual gesture. Paperwork can be handled, honey. These things can be undone. We're family. Family assets should be distributed fairly, and right now, Marcus is at a significant disadvantage. He's talking about getting engaged to Sarah. You know that. He needs space for a family. He needs a yard for children someday. You're still single. You don't need all this space. It doesn't make sense for you to have a house this size while your brother is cramped in a small apartment. There it was. The real reason laid bare. Marcus wanted something, so Marcus would get it. The pattern that had defined my entire childhood, now extending into my adult life with even more devastating consequences. The golden child opens his mouth to express a desire, and the world rearranges itself to accommodate him. My needs, my work, my legal ownership, my year of backbreaking labor, none of it mattered compared to what Marcus wanted. My father finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm, authoritative, the voice he'd used to end arguments throughout my childhood, still not meeting my eyes, which somehow hurt more than my mother's audacious demands. Looking at me would require acknowledging what they were doing, acknowledging the injustice of it, and he couldn't do that. Liam, don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're asking you to do the right thing here. Family takes care of family. Sometimes that means making sacrifices. The right thing. For who? For Marcus? For them? For their image of themselves as fair parents who treated their children equally? When had anyone ever asked me what the right thing was for me? When had my sacrifices ever been acknowledged as anything other than expected, required, the baseline of what they expected from the practical son? I've spent a year of my life on this house, I said, my voice getting stronger as anger began to replace shock. I've worked 2 jobs to afford the materials. I've learned skills I didn't have. I've put every spare dollar into making this place livable. And now you want me to just hand it over to Marcus? In 48 hours? Where exactly do you expect me to go? My mother's expression softened into false sympathy, the look she used when she wanted to appear caring while actually being manipulative. We'll help you find an apartment, of course. We're not heartless. We'll even pay the first month's rent and deposit. You'll be fine, honey. You're resourceful. You've always landed on your feet. Marcus needs this more than you do. Marcus needs this more. Marcus, who'd been given everything his entire life. Marcus, who'd never had to work 2 jobs, never had to choose between eating and paying bills, never had to spend his weekends covered in sawdust and sweat instead of relaxing with friends. Marcus needed my house, The house I'd built from nothing, more than I did. I looked at my father, waited for him to meet my eyes, to show some sign of shame or discomfort or recognition of how wrong this was. He kept his eyes on the floor, on the hardwood floors I'd refinished myself, and said nothing. His silence was complicity. His silence was agreement. His silence was abandonment. 2 days later, Marcus showed up. He arrived in a rented moving truck, a 26-footer parked crookedly out front with the engine still running like he couldn't be bothered to turn it off properly, like he was so confident in his right to take this place that he hadn't even considered the possibility I might refuse. He had boxes stacked in the back, his belongings already packed, his confidence so thick you could choke on it. He walked up the path I'd cleared, stepping on the new pavers I'd laid to replace the broken concrete walkway, past the garden I'd planted with my own hands, past the new fence I'd installed to replace the rusted chain-link monstrosity, toward the door I'd repaired and refinished and painted a welcoming dark blue. He was already talking, not to me, to himself, planning out loud like I wasn't even there. This room would be perfect for a home office. I could do my Zoom calls in here with all this natural light. Sarah wants a walk-in closet. We could probably expand the master bedroom into that sunroom thing you built, knock out that wall there. Then he walked inside fully and stopped. His entire body went rigid, frozen mid-step, mid-word. The expression on his face drained from entitled satisfaction to something I couldn't quite read at first. Confusion? Fear? Realization? The color left his cheeks completely, leaving him pale under his expensive haircut and his designer stubble and his $200 shirt. His eyes darted from the walls to the floors to the windows, like he was seeing something he didn't expect, something that changed the entire equation. The smile vanished, replaced by a tension in his jaw that made him look, for the first time in our lives, uncertain, worried, maybe even afraid. "Liam," he said slowly, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "What's going on? Mom said you'd already be moved out. Why are you still here?" I smiled. I couldn't help it. Because in that moment, watching my brother's arrogance crack, I realized something none of them had thought to check. They'd been so focused on the house itself, on the physical structure, on the rooms and the finishes and the improvements I'd made, that they'd completely ignored the most important part. They'd ignored the ground beneath it. I'm still here because this is my house, Marcus. Legally, completely, irrevocably mine. And in about 10 days, it won't be mine anymore. But it's never going to be yours either. He looked at me like I was speaking another language. "What are you talking about?" Mom and Dad said. Mom and Dad said a lot of things. But what they signed, what they legally transferred to me, that's what actually matters. And what they gave me was more valuable than any of you realized. When my parents handed me those papers a year earlier, when they thrust that deed into my hands with barely concealed relief at dumping their problem property onto their disappointment son, I did something they never expected from the practical son who just accepted what he was given. I actually read them. Not just signed and filed away, but read. Carefully. Thoroughly. Every page. Every clause. Every piece of legal jargon that most people would skip over or gloss past. The house had been written off as worthless, a liability, a money pit they were thrilled to be rid of. The structure itself probably had negative value, actually cost more to maintain and insure than it would ever be worth. But the land, the actual property beneath the structure, that told a completely different story. While they'd been focused on the building, on the visible decay and obvious expense and the burden they were dumping on me, they'd completely ignored what should have been the most important consideration. The land itself had never been properly transferred back to them from my grandmother's original trust. It had sat in a complicated estate structure for years after she died, tangled up in probate and family disputes and legal complications that had delayed final distribution. More than that, and this was the detail that changed everything, it was zoned differently from every surrounding property. Grandfathered into a commercial residential overlap from a zoning change that had happened in the 1970s, long before the neighborhood had transitioned to purely residential development. When the city had rezoned the area from mixed use to residential only, this property and 2 others had been exempted because they had existing commercial businesses operating on them. Those businesses had closed decades ago, but the zoning designation had remained, locked in place, a quirk of municipal bureaucracy that no one had paid attention to. Until someone did. While my parents were busy furnishing Marcus's sterile apartment with designer furniture and overpriced art, while they were consulting with Svetlana about throw pillows and coffee tables, I was fixing my house and quietly, very quietly, consulting a lawyer. Not to fight my parents, not initially, just to understand exactly what I owned, what rights I had, what protections existed, what this property actually represented in legal and financial terms. I found a real estate attorney named Patricia Chun who specialized in property rights and zoning issues. I paid her $200 for an initial consultation, money I could barely afford, money that meant eating ramen for 2 weeks. But that consultation changed everything. She reviewed the deed, the title history, the zoning maps, the city records. She researched the property's history going back decades. And then she told me something that made my hands shake. This property is significantly more valuable than you realize. That zoning designation opens up development possibilities that don't exist for any other parcel in this neighborhood. If you were interested, I could put out some quiet feelers to development companies. But we need to get the structure up to code first. It's a liability right now. That's when I understood. That's when the year of brutal renovation work became not just about proving something to my family, not just about having a place to live, but about positioning myself for an opportunity that my parents had handed me completely by accident. And what I discovered through Patricia's research was that I didn't just own a renovated house on a decent lot. I owned a piece of land that multiple development companies had been circling for years, blocked from making offers by the previous ownership structure and my grandmother's estate complications. 3 months earlier, I'd been approached. A development company, mid-sized but ambitious, called Meridian Development Partners. They'd done their research, hired people to track property ownership changes, zoning designations, development opportunities in appreciating neighborhoods. They'd identified my property as a critical piece in a larger development plan for the area. The first contact came through Patricia. They'd reached out to her after seeing her name on some filings related to the property. She called me on a Wednesday evening. "Liam, I have a development company interested in your property. Before you say anything, you should hear the preliminary number they're floating." She told me. I had to sit down. It was more than I made in 5 years at both my jobs combined. But it came with conditions, requirements, complications. The property needed safety certifications, building code compliance across multiple categories, environmental assessments to ensure there were no contamination issues that would complicate development. The house itself, the structure, needed to meet minimum habitability standards before the sale could finalize because the company's insurance wouldn't allow them to take possession of a property that was actively dangerous. That's why I'd worked so hard on the renovations. That's why I'd spent every spare moment and every spare dollar bringing the house up to code. Not just for pride, not just to prove something to my family, though those had been part of it, but because every repair, every upgrade, every certification I earned brought me closer to meeting the contract conditions. Last week, the final inspection had passed. The city building inspector, a meticulous man named Rodriguez who'd seen every shortcut and code violation imaginable, had walked through my house with his clipboard and his camera and his measuring tape. He'd checked the electrical work I'd done, verified it was up to code. He'd examined the plumbing repairs, confirmed they met current standards. He'd tested the smoke detectors, the carbon monoxide detectors, the GFCI outlets in the kitchen and bathroom. He'd measured the egress windows in the bedrooms to ensure they met emergency exit requirements. And at the end, he'd signed off. The building was up to code. Habitable. Legal. Safe. The contract was ready to execute. The money was sitting in escrow, a number so large it still felt fictional every time I thought about it, waiting only for my signature on the final documents and the completion of a few remaining due diligence items on the developer's side. So when my mother stood in my kitchen, the kitchen where I'd replaced every appliance and installed new countertops with my own hands, and said, "We're taking this house back," I calmly asked her exactly how she planned to do that. Her face flushed with frustration, with the realization that I wasn't simply accepting her decree the way I'd accepted everything else in my life. "We're your parents, Liam. We gave it to you. We can take it back. Family doesn't need permission to adjust arrangements. This is about what's fair for everyone." That's when I walked to the small office I'd set up in the converted closet under the stairs and pulled out the folder. The thick, legal-sized folder I'd been maintaining for months. The folder that contained the documentation of everything I'd done, everything I owned, everything they couldn't touch. Deed. Title. Zoning certificates showing the commercial residential overlay. Environmental assessment showing no contamination. Building code compliance documentation from every inspection. And on top, the contract with Meridian Development Partners. I placed it gently on the kitchen counter I'd installed myself, the one made from butcher block I'd sealed and oiled with my own hands. I didn't say anything at first. I just opened the folder and let the papers speak for themselves, let my parents see the reality they'd ignored. Silence fell like a heavy curtain, thick and suffocating. My father picked up the documents first, his hands trembling as he began to read. He started with the deed, confirming what he already knew, that the property was in my name. Then he picked up the zoning certificate, and I watched his expression change as he realized what he was looking at, what that designation meant. My mother leaned over his shoulder, her perfectly made-up face tightening with every line, every clause, every number her eyes processed. Her hand went to her mouth when she saw the contract with the purchase price clearly listed in paragraph 3. Marcus stepped closer, his earlier confidence evaporating like water on hot pavement, replaced by panic as he realized this wasn't about room layouts and paint colors anymore. This was about something much bigger, something that was slipping away from him before he'd ever actually had it, something he'd been promised but had no legal right to claim. I told them the truth slowly, clearly, enunciating each word so there could be no misunderstanding, no later claims of confusion or misrepresentation. The house is legally mine. The deed is in my name, properly recorded with the county clerk, completely and irrevocably transferred. The land is legally mine, with a zoning designation that makes it significantly more valuable than any of you understood or bothered to research. And in less than 2 weeks, I won't own any of it because I'm selling. Not to Marcus, not back to you, but to developers who actually understand its worth, who've done their research, who see the opportunity you completely missed. My mother's voice cracked, the composure she'd maintained for decades finally fracturing, showing the fear and anger underneath. "How much?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "How much are they offering you?" I told her the number, the exact figure, down to the last dollar. I didn't round it or soften it or try to make it easier to hear. I wanted them to know precisely what they'd given away, precisely what they'd tried to steal back, precisely how badly they'd miscalculated. I watched her knees nearly give out, watched her reach for the counter to steady herself, watched my father reach to support her with one hand while still holding the contract in the other. I watched Marcus's face go from pale to gray to almost green, watched him process the realization that this money, this opportunity, this future could have been his if they'd just given him this property in the first place, if they'd made a different choice about which son deserved what. It was more than they'd spent on his apartment. Significantly more. His apartment had cost $385,000, and they'd been so proud of that purchase, so pleased with themselves for giving him such a valuable asset. This sale was for $1.2 million, more than 3 times what they'd invested in him. It was more than they'd ever planned to invest in me, more than they'd probably spend on both of us combined throughout our entire childhoods if you added up every birthday present, every Christmas gift, every school expense, every sports fee, every everything. And they couldn't match it. Even if they liquidated everything they owned, even if they sold Marcus's apartment and their own house and cashed out their retirement accounts, they couldn't come close to matching what the developers were offering. The market had spoken, and it had valued what I owned far above anything they had to give. Marcus started the bargaining first, his voice high and strained, desperate in a way I'd never heard from him before. Marcus, who'd always had everything, who'd never had to beg or plead or negotiate for anything because it was always just given to him. "This isn't fair, Liam. This isn't right. I already told Sarah about this place. I already promised her we'd have a house, that we'd have space to start a family. I showed her pictures. She's been planning where furniture would go. You can't just sell it out from under me. It was supposed to be mine. Mom promised me." I looked at my brother, really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years. Looked past the expensive clothes and the perfect hair and the confidence that came from never being told no. Looked at the person who'd been given every advantage, every benefit of the doubt, every extra chance, and still somehow believed he deserved more. Who thought that our parents' empty promise, a promise they had no legal right to make, gave him more claim than my legal ownership and year of brutal work. It was never yours, Marcus, I said quietly, calmly, without anger because I was past anger now. It was never going to be yours. The deed was in my name from day one. What Mom and Dad promised you doesn't change legal reality. You don't have a claim. You don't have a right. You have nothing except a promise from people who promised you something that wasn't theirs to give. My mother tried a different approach, her voice shifting to the manipulative sweetness she used when logic failed, when authority failed, when she needed to deploy emotional manipulation instead. Liam, honey, let's be reasonable here. Let's think this through. We can work something out that's fair to everyone. We'll give you Marcus's apartment. You can move into his place. It's beautiful. It's new. It's ready to live in. You won't have to maintain anything. Won't have to worry about repairs or renovations ever again. Doesn't that sound better than all this stress? And you can still sell this property, give most of the money to Marcus to make up for the apartment, and keep some for yourself. Everyone wins. The apartment. The 850 square foot box in a building with paper-thin walls and HOA fees that cost more than most people's car payments. She was offering it like it was equivalent, like location and square footage and a year of my life, and $1.2 million were all negotiable variables in an equation she could balance. No, I said simply. The apartment isn't worth a fraction of what this property is worth, and you know it. Marcus's apartment is worth maybe $385,000 on today's market. This property is selling for $1.2 million. That's not even close to equivalent. More than that, I don't want it. I don't want your hand-me-downs and your scraps and your guilt offerings and your attempts to rebalance things now that you've realized you miscalculated. I'm done with that. I'm done with accepting less and being told to be grateful for it. My father finally met my eyes, really met them for the first time in probably a decade, and I saw something there I'd never seen before. Respect, maybe, or fear, or the recognition that he'd miscalculated badly and was now facing consequences he couldn't charm or reason or authority his way out of. For the first time in my life, my father was looking at me as an equal, as someone who had power, as someone who couldn't be controlled. Son, he started, his voice heavy with a gravitas that might have worked on younger me, on the version of me who still desperately wanted his approval. We can work something out here. Family is supposed to take care of each other. We're supposed to compromise, to help each other, to make sure everyone's okay. We made a mistake in how we initially distributed things. We see that now. But we can fix it. Just tell us what you want. Like you compromised when you gave Marcus a fully furnished $385,000 apartment and gave me a condemned building you expected to cost me money to even make livable? Like you compromised when his college tuition came with no strings attached, while I worked 2 jobs to cover my expenses? Like you compromised when his failures were reframed as learning experiences and mine were treated as character flaws that needed to be corrected? Like you've been compromising my entire life by treating me like the backup plan, the spare, the one who'd be fine with less because he always had been. The words came out harder than I'd intended, but not harder than I'd felt them. Not harder than they deserved. Years of swallowed resentment, of forced gratitude, of playing the role they'd assigned me, of being the practical son who didn't complain, all of it finally boiling over in one long release. My mother started crying, actual tears streaming down her face, though whether they were real or tactical I'd stopped being able to tell years ago. She'd always been able to produce tears when she needed them, when guilt and manipulation required that extra touch of emotional leverage. How can you be so cruel to us? We raised you. We gave you everything we could. We did our best. How can you throw that back in our faces like this? We're your parents. Doesn't that mean anything to you? You gave Marcus everything. I corrected, my voice steady now, clear, certain. You gave me what was left over and told me to be grateful for it. You gave him the good presents and me the practical ones. You gave him your time and attention and gave me lectures about responsibility. You gave him unconditional support and gave me conditional acceptance based on whether I was meeting your expectations. Well, I'm grateful. I'm grateful you gave me this worthless house, because it turns out you were wrong about its value, just like you've been wrong about my value my entire life. They tried everything after that. They went through every strategy in the manipulation playbook, every tactic they'd used successfully on me for 27 years. Guilt about family bonds and how disappointed my grandmother would be if she could see us fighting like this, how she'd wanted her estate to bring the family together, not tear us apart. My mother invoked her memory like a weapon, like my grandmother wouldn't have been disgusted by how they'd treated me, how they'd given me the worst property and expected me to smile about it. Anger about respect and gratitude, and how dare I speak to them this way? How dare I throw their generosity back in their faces? How dare I value money over family? My father's voice rose for the first time, his face flushed red, his fist hitting the counter hard enough to make the documents jump. But I didn't flinch. I'd spent too many years flinching. Promises about future considerations and wedding gifts and being included fairly in the will, as if I'd ever see a fair distribution there either, as if I hadn't learned exactly what their promises were worth. They swore things would be different, that they'd learned their lesson, that they'd treat me better going forward if I'd just do this one thing for Marcus. Bargaining about splitting the money, about me keeping half and giving half to Marcus, about using it to buy him a different house, about finding some compromise that would make everyone happy. They threw out numbers, percentages, proposals, each one slightly better than the last, each one still fundamentally unfair. But it was too late. Not too late legally. The paperwork had been ironclad from the beginning. Patricia had made sure of that. Too late emotionally. Too late to rebuild what they'd spent 27 years tearing down, one small dismissal at a time, one comparison at a time, one reminder that Marcus was the favorite at a time. I wasn't angry anymore. Not the hot, burning anger I'd felt standing in their living room a year ago being handed the keys to a wreck and told to be grateful. I was done. Simply, completely, irrevocably done. Done trying to earn their love. Done accepting less. Done playing the role of the reasonable son who swallowed every disappointment and smiled. 2 weeks later, the developer's representatives arrived. Professional, efficient, carrying certified checks and notaries and all the machinery of a significant financial transaction. We met at a title company called Pinnacle Title Services, neutral territory, everything proper and legal and final and witnessed and recorded. The conference room had a long table with leather chairs. Patricia Chin sat on my right. The developer sent 2 representatives, their acquisitions director, a sharp woman named Jennifer Martinez, and their legal counsel, an older man named David Kim. The title company provided a notary and an escrow officer. We spent 2 hours reviewing documents, signing papers, initializing clauses, confirming wire transfer information. Patricia reviewed every page before I signed. Even though we'd been through all of this before, even though we both knew exactly what we were signing. The developer's attorney did the same. The notary witnessed and stamped and recorded. Marcus never moved in. The boxes went back on the truck, still packed, returned to whatever storage unit or friend's garage they'd been staged in. Sarah probably got some explanation about why the house he'd promised her was no longer available. I wondered if he told her the truth or made up something that made him look better. My parents stopped calling, stopped texting, the silence from them more final than any argument or confrontation. No apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no attempt at reconciliation. Just silence, which told me everything I needed to know about what I'd actually meant to them. The sale finalized on a Thursday afternoon at 3:47 p.m. I signed the last document, watched the notary apply her stamp, saw the numbers transfer on the computer screen showing the wire transfer completing. The house that had been my punishment, my test, my transformation, belonged to Meridian Development Partners now. The land that my parents had dismissed, that they'd written off as worthless, that they'd given me expecting it to be a burden, would become something new. I learned later that they were planning a mixed-use development. Retail on the ground floor, residential above, taking full advantage of that commercial residential zoning that my parents had never bothered to research. It would probably benefit the whole neighborhood, bring in new businesses, increase property values, create jobs. The eyesore would become an asset to the community. I went to see it one last time before the demolition permit was filed, before the bulldozers arrived to tear down everything I'd built. Stood in front of the building I'd rebuilt from ruins, ran my hand along the porch railing I'd installed, looked through the windows at the rooms I'd transformed. I walked around back to where my garden had been, already overgrown again in the weeks since I'd moved out, nature reclaiming what I'd temporarily tamed. I felt pride, not loss. That house had never been my future. It had been my education. It had taught me skills I'd use for the rest of my life. It had taught me that I was capable of more than anyone had given me credit for, including myself. It had taught me that value isn't always obvious, that underestimation can be an advantage, that the thing they look down on can hold more power than they imagine. With the money, I bought my own place. Not in the city where Marcus lived, where I'd constantly run into my parents at restaurants and theaters and farmers markets, where I'd be reminded of everything I was supposed to be grateful for. I bought a small house 40 minutes away in a neighborhood called Riverside Heights, close enough to my job, far enough from my past. It wasn't as big as the one I'd renovated. It didn't need to be. It was 1,200 square feet, 2 bedrooms, 1.5 bathrooms, built in 1985 and well-maintained by the previous owners. It needed some cosmetic updates, but was structurally sound. It was mine on my own terms, purchased with my own money, free from family complications and unspoken conditions and the weight of their expectations. I paid cash, $340,000, which left me with over $800,000 after Patricia's fees and capital gains taxes and the various costs of the sale. I invested most of it, working with a financial advisor to create a diversified portfolio that would grow over time. I kept some liquid for emergencies and improvements in life. I furnished the house slowly, carefully, choosing each piece deliberately instead of accepting hand-me-downs or gift-wrapped obligations. I bought a couch I actually liked instead of one that matched some decorator's vision. I painted the walls colors I actually wanted instead of neutral tones chosen to avoid offense. I hung art that meant something to me instead of generic prints chosen to fill space. I built a workshop in the garage for all the tools I'd accumulated, the skills I'd learned. I installed pegboard and workbenches and proper lighting. I organized everything meticulously, labeled drawers, created a space where I could work on projects that mattered to me instead of just survival repairs. I quit one of my jobs. For the first time in 2 years, I was only working 40 hours a week instead of 70. I started sleeping more than 5 hours a night. I had time to cook real meals instead of eating whatever was fastest. I had time to read books, to watch movies, to remember what hobbies felt like. I began dating someone I met at a coffee shop. A woman named Rachel who worked as a teacher and had never heard the stories about golden children and disappointing sons, who saw me as I actually was rather than as the family narrative had written me. She knew I had family I didn't talk to, but she didn't push, didn't demand explanations, just accepted that some relationships end, and that's okay. 6 months after the sale, I heard through a mutual acquaintance, a former neighbor from my parents' street who'd always been kind to me, that Marcus's apartment had been sold. My parents needed money, some investment that had gone bad, some expense they hadn't planned for. The irony wasn't lost on me, bitter and perfect in its symmetry. The asset they'd considered valuable, the one they'd protected and prioritized, the one they'd used as the standard for what Marcus deserved, had become a liability they needed to liquidate to cover their mistakes. Meanwhile, the asset they'd dumped on me as a burden, expecting it to cost me money and effort and frustration, had set me free. I didn't gloat, didn't call to rub it in or demand apologies I'd never receive anyway. I just noted it, filed it away as confirmation of what I'd already learned, and moved on with my life. Marcus reached out once, about 8 months after everything fell apart. A text message, carefully worded, probably drafted and revised a dozen times before he had the courage to send it. Hey Liam, I know things are weird between us. I was thinking maybe we could meet for coffee sometime. Talk. Clear the air. I miss my brother. I read it twice, sitting in my new living room in my new house in my new life, considered my options carefully, and declined politely. I appreciate the thought, Marcus, but I don't think that would be productive for either of us. I hope you're doing well. Not because I was angry at him, not really. He'd been raised the same way I had, just on the opposite side of the favoritism equation. But because there was nothing left to clear. The air was already as clear as it needed to be. We were strangers who shared parents and a childhood. That didn't obligate me to a relationship as adults. My father sent an email a year later. A long, rambling thing about family and regrets and how things had gotten out of hand. He didn't apologize exactly, didn't acknowledge the fundamental unfairness of how they'd treated me, didn't take responsibility for his role in creating and maintaining that inequality for 27 years. But he implied that maybe, possibly, in hindsight, with the benefit of reflection, some decisions could have been handled differently. It was the closest thing to an admission I'd ever get from him, and we both knew it. I responded briefly, cordially, acknowledging receipt of his email, and changed the subject. Asked how his golf game was going. mentioned I was doing well, and left it at that. I wasn't interested in rehabilitation or redemption arcs or tearful reconciliations where we all hugged and pretended the past hadn't happened. I'd build a new life, and it didn't have room for people who'd spent decades teaching me I was worth less than my brother. I'm 30 now. 3 years past the day they handed me those papers and expected gratitude. The money from the sale is mostly invested, growing steadily at an average of 7% annually, a foundation I actually trust because I built it myself. I still work in construction management, but now I'm a senior coordinator with equity in the company, respected for my knowledge and my work ethic rather than tolerated as the person willing to do what others won't. My salary has increased significantly. I'm being considered for a project manager position. I've helped 3 friends renovate their houses, teaching them what I learned, sharing the skills I earned through necessity and transformed into expertise. There's something deeply satisfying about passing on knowledge, about helping people see potential in places others have written off, about watching someone's face light up when they realize they can do something they thought was beyond their capabilities. I'm telling you this story not because I want sympathy or praise for overcoming adversity or whatever narrative makes it feel inspirational. I'm telling you because I know there are people reading this who've been exactly where I was, standing in their parents' living room, or their boss's office, or their relationship, being handed scraps and being told to call it a feast, being given the worst option and being expected to be grateful for it, being treated as less than while being told it's fair. If that's you, here's what I learned. The lessons that cost me a year of brutal work and 27 years of pain to understand. First, always read the documents. Every page, every clause, every piece of fine print that most people skip over because it's boring or technical or seems unimportant. The thing they're dismissing might be more valuable than they realize. The liability they're dumping might be an asset in disguise. Don't trust their assessment of worth. They have blind spots, biases, incomplete information. Do your own research. Hire experts if you can afford it. Understand exactly what you're getting, what rights you have, what opportunities exist. Second, being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you believe them, if you internalize their assessment and make it your own. My parents looked at me and saw the practical one, the one who'd make do, the one who didn't need as much. They were right that I was practical, but wrong about what that meant. Being practical meant I actually learned how to build things, how to create value, how to transform potential into reality. Marcus got the easy path and never developed the skills to handle difficulty. I got the hard path and became someone who could handle anything. Who would you rather be? Third, family isn't a magic word that erases fairness or justifies mistreatment. They tried to use it like a trump card, like saying, "We're family," meant I was obligated to accept whatever they decided, to prioritize Marcus's wants over my needs, to sacrifice what I'd earned so he could have what he wanted. But real family, healthy family, doesn't work that way. Real family doesn't give one child everything and the other child scraps. Real family doesn't show up demanding you hand over your hard-earned success so the favorite can have it instead. You don't owe people access to your life just because you share DNA. Fourth, know when to walk away. I could have fought them for years, tried to maintain some version of a relationship while protecting my boundaries, exhausted myself trying to make them see my worth, seeking the approval and love they were never going to give. Instead, I took my win and left. Not every battle needs to be fought to the bitter end. Sometimes victory is building something better somewhere else and letting them live with their choices. Fifth, and this is the hardest one to truly internalize, the anger will fade, but don't let the lesson fade with it. I'm not angry at my parents anymore. Anger requires too much energy, too much attention directed at people who don't deserve it, too much space in my head and my heart. But I haven't forgotten what they taught me about who they are, what they value, how they treat people. I haven't convinced myself that time heals all wounds, or that blood is thicker than water, or any of the other platitudes people use to pressure you back into toxic situations. Forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. You can release anger while still maintaining boundaries. That house, that dilapidated, worthless burden of a house they gave me expecting it to be an anchor around my neck, turned out to be the best gift they ever could have given me, though they'll never understand why. Not because of the money, though that changed my trajectory significantly and gave me opportunities I'd never have had otherwise. but because it forced me to stop waiting for them to see my value and start creating it myself. They looked at that property and saw an eyesore, a liability, a problem to dump on the son they'd already written off as less important. They never looked deeper, never checked the zoning, never researched the development potential, never considered that there might be more to it than the surface appearance. They assumed their assessment was correct and moved on, congratulating themselves on their generosity while actually revealing their bias. I looked at the same property and saw exactly what it was, a wreck that would take everything I had to fix, that would require skills I didn't have and would need to learn, that would cost me money and time and comfort. But I also saw that it was mine, legally and completely, and that maybe, just maybe, there was more to it than appeared on the surface. So I looked deeper. I did the research. I consulted experts. I found the hidden value. The difference wasn't intelligence or luck or some special gift I had. It was necessity. They could afford to be careless because they'd always had resources to fall back on, safety nets and generational wealth and the confidence that comes from never really facing consequences. I couldn't afford to be careless because I'd never had that safety net, had always been one mistake or one piece of bad luck away from real hardship. So I did the work. The physical work of renovation, yes, but also the mental work of research, of understanding my rights, of consulting experts, of reading every document, of asking every question. I did the emotional work of accepting that my family would never prioritize me the way they prioritized Marcus, and deciding that I didn't need them to, that I could create my own worth independent of their recognition. 3 years later, I own my life in a way I never did before. Not just financially, though that matters, though having money in the bank and a paid-off house and a growing investment portfolio provides security I'd never known. But psychologically, emotionally, I'm not waiting for their approval or their acknowledgement or their love. I'm not measuring my worth by their standards or accepting their assessment of my value. I'm not playing a role in their family narrative anymore. I'm not the practical son anymore. I'm not the reasonable one or the one who makes do or the one who should be grateful for less. I'm just Liam, a man who turned a worthless gift into a valuable lesson, who learned that sometimes the worst thing they can give you becomes the best thing that ever happened to you, who built a life on his own terms using skills they accidentally taught him by forcing him to figure things out alone. If you're standing in that living room right now, looking at the scraps they're handing you and calling it generosity, calling it fairness, calling it family love, here's what you do. Read the fine print. Do the research. Look deeper than the surface. Consult experts who don't have a stake in the outcome. The thing they're dismissing might be exactly what you need, might hold value they can't see, might be the foundation of something they can't imagine. And if it really is just scraps with nothing hidden underneath, if you look deep and find that yes, this really is just less, just worse, just unfair with no silver lining, then at least you'll know for certain, and you can make your decisions with full information instead of false hope. You can walk away knowing you gave it every chance, that you looked for the value and it genuinely wasn't there. Either way, you'll be further ahead than if you'd just accepted their assessment and been grateful for it. That's the lesson. That's what I learned from the old, dilapidated house my parents gave me while they gave my brother a brand new apartment, expecting me to smile and thank them and accept that I deserved less. They thought they were dumping their problem on their disappointing son. Instead, they handed me the foundation for a completely different life, one where I don't need them to give me value because I learned how to create it myself. And 3 years later, I'm standing in my own house, the one I chose and bought and owned completely, drinking my morning coffee and watching the sunrise through windows I picked out. And I've never been more grateful for that dilapidated house or the parents who gave it to me while thinking they were being generous. Because it taught me the most important lesson of all: never let someone else's assessment of your worth become your own. They might be looking at the surface while missing everything underneath. They might be wrong about value, wrong about potential, wrong about you. Do your own research. Trust your own judgment. Build your own foundation. And when they come back wanting what they gave away, when they realize too late that they underestimated what they had, when they try to reclaim what they threw away because they finally understand its value, you'll already be gone, building something better somewhere they can't reach, living a life they can't touch. That's not revenge. That's just finally understanding your own worth and refusing to accept less than you deserve.